Good morning. I just learned about the passing of a good friend of mine and a holy woman, Terry Stevens. She's a lay minister of our diocese, and so I pray for her eternal repose. She did some of the retreats in our parish in the last few years, so may she rest in peace and see the face of Jesus in the eternal Jerusalem. This is the third Sunday of Advent, the Sunday of Joy. There are two kinds of peoples: the ones that make things happen and the ones that wait for things to happen to them. On this third Sunday of Advent, we hear from Isaiah that the desert and the parched land will exult, that the steppe will rejoice and bloom. They will bloom with abundant flowers and rejoice with joyful song, because they will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. So Isaiah is using the image of the desert, speaking of a future dark moment of the history of Israel, which was the exile, that eventually would turn into dancing and rejoicing, because the people will return back to their land. And that moment of return was a blooming, is the presence of the returnees in the desert. So it's a future hope of a blooming desert. In the letter of James, we hear an image of agriculture. Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits patiently for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. So you too must be patient. So here, St. James uses the image of the rain as this blessing coming from God, and the importance of waiting patiently for the providence of God. How many of us struggle with patience? I bet all of you, right? And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus mentions the desert once again. Jesus began to speak to the crowds about St. John the Baptist. What did you go out to the desert to see? Why did you go out? To see a prophet? Yes, and more than a prophet. So once again, we see this image of the desert blooming by the preaching of John the Baptist and by the miracles of Jesus himself. The blind regain their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news proclaimed to them. And all this blooming is happening in this desertic land. Well, I grew up in the desert. In my hometown in Peru, we only get one rain every other year. That's it. When you hear about the climate phenomenon of El Niño or La Niña, you heard about them before? Okay. We do get a lot of rain because of those phenomena once. And then there is nothing for 2 years. That's how the desert is. This is not due to climate change or carbon emissions. This is just the cycle of nature in our region of the world. And actually, archaeology proves it, because ancient Peruvians had to deal with the desert coast from ancient times, even before the Incas. There is plenty of archaeological evidence of how ancient Peruvians transformed the desert into an oasis. Literally, we make the desert bloom. I didn't know any of this until I left my hometown, because for me that was normal, to live in the middle of the desert. I thought everybody lived in a desert until I came to Michigan and everything is green. Back in my childhood, I remember, and I learned all these things from Dad, we couldn't just wait for things to happen. We had to make things happen. My dad retired as an agricultural engineer after spending his entire life in coordinating irrigation systems for the local farmers. You had to pay big money for water. It was the only way to get it. The rainwater that falls in the Andean mountains never made it to our side, never goes to the western side of Peru, the Pacific Ocean. Everything goes east to feed the Amazon River. That's why Brazil, our neighbor, is so green. All the water goes to that way. It never comes to our side. Nothing comes to the west coast of Peru. You just cannot expect water to fall from the sky because it ain't going to come down. You have to make it come somehow. Near my hometown, there is a great man-made reservoir called Tinajones. And if it wasn't for this reservoir, we would not be able to water our crops. And without this reservoir, my dad would not have had a job. So his job was irrigation. And now, in our region, we grow rice. You know how much water rice needs? But all of that because of great engineering. In the desert, we grow rice. So there are two kinds of peoples. The ones that make things happen, and the ones that wait for things to happen to them. In my biblical pilgrimages, I had to visit many deserts. Deserted areas of the country of Turkey, the Syrian desert, the Jordanian desert, which is the beginning of the Arabian desert, the Sinai desert. That one is unbelievably dry. And yet there is still life. People live there. And also the Judean desert by the Dead Sea in Israel. You can see rocks and sands everywhere. And in the middle of all of this, little oases of date farms. Like these big palm trees with dates in the middle of the desert. And all of this is done with dripping irrigation. You know about that, you know, one drop, another drop, another drop, another one. Talk about patience. You know, these are automatic systems that save so much water and allows the desert to be turned into an oasis because of agricultural techniques. And actually in Peru we imported several techniques of the Israelis because our deserts are very similar. The landscape of my hometown in Peru and the landscape of the desertic areas of Israel are very, very similar. I didn't know any of that until I actually went to the Holy Land. So now we even grow tomatoes in the desert using dripping irrigation. One drop, another drop, another drop. And you can literally watch your tomatoes grow as the drops come to these plants in the middle of the desert. So we cannot just wait for the rain because it ain't gonna come down. We have to make the rain happen. And through our ingenuity, the gift of intelligence that God gave us, God still provides, and through us, He makes the desert bloom. Today is a Sunday of joy. Joy doesn't just simply happen. You have to choose it. You have to be intentional about it. You have to make joy happen. Joy is just like love. Love is not a feeling. Love is a commitment. Those who are married understand you have to choose every day to love and to honor your spouse. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't just fall from the sky. You have to be intentional about it. There are two kinds of peoples. The ones that make things happen and the ones who wait for things to happen to them. Who do you want to be? So brothers and sisters, choose joy. A blooming desert. Make it happen. Intentionally make your desert bloom. Amen.